Every nation remembers its heroes. Some names are carved into monuments. Some are repeated in classrooms. Some are spoken so often that they seem impossible to forget. But history is not always fair. Some heroes, no less brave, no less important, slowly fade into the margins, not because they did too little, but because the world did not remember them loudly enough. In the Philippines, one of those heroes was a woman, not merely a supporter of revolution, not merely a witness to war, but a woman who took up arms, rode into battle, led fighters, and stood in the fire of history at a time when war was seen as a man's world. Her name was Teresa Magbanua. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines identifies her as the first woman in Panay to fight for Philippine freedom. The National Commission for Culture and the Arts describes her as the only woman in Visayan history to lead warriors against Spanish and American troops. Because of her role in the struggle, she became known as the Joan of Arc of the Visayas. And yet, outside the Philippines and even within it, her name is far less known than it should be. So tonight, we reopen a page of history that should never have been allowed to dim. This is the story of Teresa Magbanua, teacher, warrior, leader, and one of the bravest women the world has yet to fully remember. To understand Teresa Magbanua, we have to understand the world that shaped her. In the late 19th century, the Philippines was still under Spanish colonial rule. Across the islands, people lived beneath a system built on control, hierarchy, and foreign authority. This was the atmosphere into which Teresa Magbanua was born in Potatan, Iloilo, on the island of Panay. Official records do not fully agree on the exact year. The NHCP historical marker lists 1868, while the NCCA profile gives the 4th of November 1871. Both sources, however, agree on the place, her family, and her importance. That disagreement over her birth year may seem small, but in another sense it says something bigger. Even the birth of a great hero can blur when history does not guard her memory carefully enough. Teresa was born to Juan Magbanua and Alejandra Ferraris in a large and relatively well-off family. The NHCP marker also records that her brothers Pascual and Elias Magbanua would later become heroes of the Philippine Revolution as well. She did not grow up as a symbol. She was simply a daughter of Panay, living in a country not yet free. But history has a way of calling certain people forward. Before Teresa Magbanua became a warrior, she was a teacher, and that matters because before she led people through conflict, she first shaped minds through education. According to the NCCA profile, Teresa studied first at Colegio de San Jose in Jaro, Iloilo, then completed her teacher training at Colegio de Santa Catalina in Manila. She later taught in several towns in Iloilo, and was eventually assigned to Sara, Iloilo, where she married Alejandro Balderas, a farmer. If you had seen her then, you might not have guessed that history was preparing her for battle. She was educated, disciplined, respected, and perhaps that is part of what makes her story so powerful. Heroes do not always begin in the places we expect. Sometimes they begin in ordinary rooms, in quiet labor, in lives that appear peaceful until the moment silence is no longer enough. Then came revolution. When resistance spread in Panay under General Martin Delgado, Teresa Magbanua joined the Revolutionary Army, but according to the NCCA profile, she was not immediately welcomed without hesitation. Her father-in-law, General Perfecto Poblador, who led the northern zone of Panay, reportedly had doubts, because the belief was still strong that war was no place for a woman. And here one of Teresa's greatest battles began, not only against colonial rule, but against the assumptions of her own time. The world around her expected women to stay behind, to remain careful, to remain quiet, to remain outside the machinery of war. Teresa Magbanua refused that role. The NCCA records that she soon proved herself in combat, especially through her marksmanship and her skill in horsemanship. She was not there to decorate a revolution, she was there to fight in it. That is the difference between being remembered as a symbol and being remembered as a force. Teresa Magbanua became a force. History remembers many men who led armies, but far fewer women were given that place and fewer still truly seized it. Teresa Magbanua did. The NHCP identifies her as the first woman in Panay to fight for Philippine freedom. The NCCA goes even further, describing her as the only woman in Visayan history who led warriors against both Spanish and American soldiers. That is not a poetic exaggeration. That is her recorded place in history. Think about that for a moment. In a society where military command was overwhelmingly male, men followed her into battle, a woman gave the orders. A woman rode at the front. A woman stood where history had long assumed only men could stand. That is why she was later called the Joan of Arc of the Visayas. Not because the comparison sounded dramatic, but because it captured something real. Teresa Magbanua represented an extraordinary fusion of courage, leadership, and defiance in wartime. Courage sounds beautiful in retrospect, but in history, courage is tested by the first gunshot. According to the NCCA, Teresa Magbanua led a group of men in the Battle of Barrio Yoting in Capiz in December 1898. She also fought in the Battle of Sapong Hills near Sara, Iloilo. These were not symbolic appearances. These were real engagements in a real war. Imagine the scene: mud, smoke, fear. The uncertainty of whether the next shot might be the last. And there, in the middle of it, a woman commanding fighters in a colonial war. That image alone should have secured her a permanent place in world memory. But history is full of people who deserved permanence and received only fragments. Still, in those moments, Teresa Magbanua established something no one could erase. She had not simply joined the struggle, she had earned authority within it. Heroism is never made only of victory, it is also made of loss. The NHCP marker records that Teresa's brothers Pascual and Elias Magbanua were also heroes of the revolution. The NCCA notes that both brothers died during the revolutionary struggle. That matters, because war does not merely create legends, it breaks families. Behind the title, behind the image of a woman on horseback, there was also a sister who endured the deaths of her brothers. Behind the glory of resistance was grief deep, personal, and permanent. And still, she continued. That is what makes certain people larger than history books can easily contain. Not that they fought once, but that they carried on even after paying the price. For many revolutionaries, the struggle did not end with Spain. The flag changed, the pressure remained. According to the NCCA, during the Philippine-American War, Teresa Magbanua again took part in numerous battles and guerrilla operations. When Panay was surrendered in 1900, she disbanded her unit and withdrew to a quiet life in the countryside with her husband. This part of her story matters just as much as the battles, because it shows that her patriotism was not tied to one single moment, one single enemy, or one brief season of defiance. She endured more than one war, more than one occupying power, more than one chapter of national pain, and then, like many fighters after history moves on, she disappeared from the center of public attention. No parade, no global fame, just the long silence that often follows sacrifice. There is a strange cruelty in the way history works. A person can risk everything for a nation, and still live long enough to be slowly forgotten by that nation's louder stories. After Panay's surrender, Teresa Magbanua lived more quietly. The NCCA says she stayed in the countryside with her husband after disbanding her unit. It was a different life from the one she had led in war, but it did not make her earlier courage any smaller. In fact, there is something deeply human in this phase of her life. The warrior returned to the ordinary world. The commander stepped away from battle. The woman history should have celebrated more loudly grew old outside the center of national fame. And that may be one reason her story faded for so many people. When heroes stop appearing dramatic, the world often stops looking at them. But Teresa Magbanua's patriotism did not end with age. According to the NCCA, during the Second World War, she provided financial support to the guerrilla movement in Iloilo. By then, she was no longer the young battlefield commander of Panay, but she was still part of the struggle for her country's survival. That detail changes the shape of her legacy. She was not only a heroine of youth, not only a warrior of one revolution, she was a patriot across generations of conflict. Sometimes people fight with rifles, sometimes with strategy, sometimes with resources, shelter, money and resolve. The form changes, the loyalty remains. After the war, Teresa Magbanua lived in Pagadian, Zamboanga del Sur. The NCCA says she died there in August 1947, while the NHCP marker records that she died in Zamboanga in 1947. The NCCA also notes that her townspeople called her Naisa. It is a tender name, a human name, a name that suggests affection, memory and familiarity, and maybe that is fitting, because Teresa Magbanua was not only a figure of war, she was also someone's daughter, wife, sister, neighbor and elder. To reduce her to a title alone would be too small. To forget her would be worse. How does a heroine like Teresa Magbanua become less known than she deserves? Not all at once, not through one decision, but slowly through repetition of other names, through the narrowing of national memory, through the quiet bias of history's more comfortable celebrating male commanders, through the simple passage of time, and yet she was never truly erased. The NHCP still honors her in a historical marker in Potitan, Iloilo. The NCCA still identifies her as a uniquely important figure in Visayan history. Her legacy remained official even if it did not always remain widely spoken. That is why remembering her now is not invention. It is restoration, not rewriting history but correcting our attention. And even now, Teresa Magbanua's name continues to move through history. The Philippine government has kept her memory alive not only in historical recognition, but in the present-day naming of a Coast Guard vessel, BRP Teresa Magbanua. In 2024, the Philippine Information Agency described the ship's difficult mission, and said its crew served in honor of the heroine for whom she was named. In 2025, the same vessel was reported returning from joint maritime drills with the United States and Japan. There is something powerful in that image. Once Teresa Magbanua rode into battle on land. Now her name sails across contested waters. From the battlefields of Panay to the ships of the modern Philippines, her legacy did not die. It endured. Even when public memory lagged behind it. Teresa Magbanua was not simply a woman who joined a revolution. She was a woman who led and won. A teacher who became a warrior, a Filipino who fought Spanish rule, a revolutionary who continued the struggle against American forces, a patriot who still supported resistance in the Second World War, a heroine whose courage was real, recorded and extraordinary. If a nation is measured in part by how it remembers those who sacrificed for it, then Teresa Magbanua deserves far more than a passing mention. She deserves a place in the world's memory, because the tragedy is not that she lacked greatness. The tragedy is that greatness does not always guarantee remembrance. But history can still be reopened. Memory can still be repaired. And some names, once nearly lost, can still rise again. Her name is Teresa Magbanua, and she should never be forgotten again. You've been watching Pastora, where history speaks, and the past was never really silent.